We all have a tendency to think that things were better when we were young. I know I do. Our music was understandable. It had words that I totally could understand. It really had lyrics. It had melodies. You know, it wasn't just beating on a metal drum. Children were more respectful. We grew up listening to adults and being patient at the dinner table and being seen and not heard. It certainly isn't true of my grandkids. We had real food instead of fast food. Children played outside. I remember that. Now they sit inside and play with computers and Game Boys and electronic devices, and so on. And so when you look around, you think, boy, it was a lot better when we were young. But not everything was better. Not everything. At least not in my world. I remember that segregation was the law of the land. Gays were non-existent because if they came out of the closet, the consequences for them were dire. Emotions were bottled up so that everybody just pretended that things were always okay. Just like on TV. Y'all remember Ozzie and Harriet? Father Knows Best? Okay, I do. And nothing was real. It was all pretend. It was all for show. And all in all, it was pretty nice to live in a world where we never talked about death. There were no child molesters. Wives were never battered by alcoholic husbands. In fact, there was no alcoholism. Didn't exist. And as long as everything stayed in the home, everybody pretended that everything was okay. Well, it wasn't. I grew up in the South in the 40s and the 50s, and when I was a child, segregation was all that I knew. My father was a political appointee of Harry Truman, so he worked in Washington, D.C., and we lived in Maryland, mostly rural Maryland. Everything in my world was segregated. Everything. The schools, the beaches, trains, buses, streetcars, hotels, restaurants, ballparks, major league teams, public drinking fountains, concert halls, movie theaters, churches, elevators and department stores. Everything you can think of was segregated. And because I was a white child, I never even associated with a black kid. I never knew one. Never even saw him. Wasn't part of my world. It was a little bit different for me because I was Jewish, but it was a given in those days that country clubs were segregated. Blacks couldn't even think about it. But they went even further than race, and they openly stated things like no Jews, Gentiles only. Management jobs in virtually every corporation in America were absolutely shut down for blacks, and most of them were not available for Jews. And we all knew it. And so we didn't even bother to apply. I was just doing some legal work for my daughter who lives in Walnut Creek, and it was regarding an easement on her house. And in order to do the work, I had to do a little research on the deed and how she got title. And I was surprised to see the original deed to her subdivision was made in 1947, 2 years after we fought a great war to free the world from dictators who purged people because of race, okay, and religion. And guess what it had? It had a covenant in the deed which excluded, and I quote, all persons not entirely of the Caucasian race. That was an interesting find for me for two reasons. First, it was from the Bay Area in California, not from the Deep South. And second, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, is half Japanese. So if that covenant were still legally valid, he couldn't live in his own house. Just struck me. Now, when my dad received his presidential political appointment in 1948, he had to submit his resignation at the same time that he accepted his appointment. And that way, if the president ever wanted to fire him, all he had to do was invoke the resignation. And I assume that's the same way today. I'm pretty sure it is. So when Eisenhower was elected in 1952, all of the Democratic appointees were dismissed and all of them were replaced with Republicans. That's the way it works in Washington. No hard feelings. That's the way it works. So we had to leave Maryland. We moved to New York, where my dad got a job lobbying the very same agency he had just administered. And that is also the way it works in Washington. In July of 1954, we went back to Washington on a vacation and to visit friends. One Sunday morning, we were all sitting around the breakfast table laughing and enjoying each other, when all of a sudden my dad fell off his chair. My brother, who was then 9, and I, thought that he was playing, so we jumped on him and started to tickle him and wrestle. And that's what 9-year-old and 12-year-old boys do. But we immediately realized that something was very wrong, and in fact, my dad was dead before he hit the floor. My mother decided to bury him in Washington because we had roots there and friends there, and we'd only lived in New York for a very short time, so she really didn't feel that that was the right place for him to be. That was 58 years ago, but I remember that funeral like it was yesterday. I remember who was there, and I remember who was not there. I was only 12. It's like a videotape in my mind. I can't turn it off. Well, I never went back to his grave during all of my junior and senior high school years. And in 1959, when I graduated high school, I left the East Coast for good. In 1979, which was 25 years after my dad had died, I was in Washington for just one day, and I went to the cemetery in hopes of finding his grave. But the cemetery office was closed, and I had to leave town the next morning, so I never found the grave. And I didn't go back to Washington until last month. Now, before I tell you about that, 3 years ago, I went back to New York for my 50th high school reunion. And thanks to email, I was able to arrange with some friends, good friends, that we get there a day or two early so that we could visit with each other and go around town and pretend that we were 17 and 18 again, which is, I guess, what you do at a reunion. We didn't know because we'd never done it, but that's what we did. Okay. We rented a car. We decided to drive to all of our old houses so that we could check them out. So we went to a few houses. We took pictures. Everybody stood in front of the house, and somebody else took a picture, and we knocked on doors and told people we used to live here 50 years ago. That was kind of fun. We reminisced, and then we drove out to Paul's house. Paul lived several miles out of town. This was Great Neck, New York, Long Island. Paul lived several miles out of town on a peninsula that stuck out into Long Island Sound, which is the body of water between Long Island and Connecticut. His house had views of Connecticut to the north and the Manhattan skyline to the east. The house looked like the French embassy that I knew from Washington, D.C. It was huge. It had 3 tennis courts, a very large swimming pool, 300 feet of frontage on the water, and a deep water dock for his yacht. And we all knew the property very well because we used to spend a lot of time there in high school. In the summer, we went swimming and boating, and in the winter, we hung out and we shot pool in his enormous pool room. Well, when we got to Paul's house, it was raining, so Paul just jumped out of the car, stood in front of the house. We took his picture, he got back in the car, and then we drove back into town. And as we came into town, we passed some old apartment buildings, which meant absolutely nothing to me, when suddenly Paul told me to stop the car. I did. I had no idea why, but I did. He got out and he said, "Take my picture." And we all asked him, why? And he said, "This is where I moved my senior year when my father went bankrupt and we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. My father and mother had 1 bedroom, and my brother and sister and I had the other bedroom. From the French embassy to a 2-bedroom apartment." We were flabbergasted. Paul's father invented plastic buttons. Okay? Fabulously wealthy. Absolutely. None of us had any idea that he had gone bankrupt. And Paul was amazed that we didn't know about it. And so he asked us, "Didn't you guys ever figure out that the entire senior year you never came to my house, not even once?" And we looked at each other in complete disbelief. But the fact was that none of us had known of the bankruptcy, and none of us had realized that we didn't go to Paul's house senior year. Not once. Because we were busy with girls and with basketball and whatever you do when you're 17 and 18. We didn't go to Paul's house. Well, we drove silently back into town, just shocked with the realization that we hadn't known that. And on impulse, I decided to make a right turn onto Beach Road. Beach Road was kind of in the poor section of town. And when I got to 15 Beach Road, I stopped in front of this old ramshackle apartment building, and I said to my friends, "Take my picture." And they said, "Why?" I said, "Because this is where I moved with my mother and my brother into a little tiny, crummy apartment when my father died." And they looked at me and they said, "Your father died?" And then we really started to talk. We learned more about each other in one day after not seeing each other for 50 years than we had known for 6 years of high school when we were all best friends, junior and senior high school. How could that happen? In the 50s, when my dad died, there was no such thing as counseling. Grief was something that was private. It wasn't public. And so we never admitted to grief. Whatever happened in the home stayed in the home. And it wasn't ever a spoken order. It was just that way. And it was not just for me, but for everyone. That's the way it was, at least in my world. We lived in an Ozzie and Harriet world. Everything was perfect. We could never publicly admit that things were bad. So for me, I just pretended in my mind that my dad was on a trip, and I never grieved because I didn't know how, and I didn't have the opportunity. It just wasn't an available option. Now, just so you know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, after that reunion, I really started to think about this, and I realized that I needed to grieve for my father's death, something I had not done. I needed closure. My sister-in-law is a marriage and family counselor, and she pushed me into the arms of a competent counselor, a grief counselor, and so I went, and she taught me how to grieve. Now, I've just come back from Washington, D.C., and I spent much of a day visiting my father's grave, and I have to say it was absolutely wonderful. It felt like this huge weight came off my shoulders. And I had thought for a while about moving him to San Luis Obispo. My mom is buried here. But as I sat at his grave, it was beautiful. It was very peaceful. The cemetery is gorgeous. And they take very good care of it. And I thought, you know, how disrespectful of me to selfishly want to move him. And so I'm not going to do it. He's fine. And I'm fine. I'm crying right now, but I'm absolutely fine. It's a good thing. Something else happened at that reunion which made an impression on me. I learned for the first time, that many of my friends from high school were gay. When we were in high school in the 50s, I never even heard that term. I didn't know what a gay was. And even when I learned about it, I would have gone to my grave swearing that there were no gays in my high school. And I was so wrong. There were quite a few gays. And some of them were the leaders of our class. They were the best athletes, the editor of the paper, and so on. And life must have been very difficult for them because they couldn't come out. And so they had to lead secret lives. Again, everything was pretend. Everything was Ozzie and Harriet.